Welcome, everyone. I'm Sandra DeCastro, and I will serve as your IMS host for this session. I'm joined by my colleague, Kara Jenkins, who will be moderating the Q&A. I encourage you to submit your comments and questions at any time during the session. It is with my great honor to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. Gregory Fowler is the 7th president of the University of Maryland Global Campus, the largest online public university in the U.S. A distinguished scholar and administrator, he is a leader in developing innovative learning models and experiences for adult and other non-traditional populations, and in leveraging technology to address longstanding challenges related to access, equity, and affordability. It is my great pleasure to welcome a staunch advocate for higher education and its power to transform lives, the president of University of Maryland Global Campus, Dr. Gregory Fowler. Dr. Fowler?
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today and for the thought and energy you bring to bear on the challenges facing higher education. My institution, the University of Maryland Global Campus, was an early adopter of online instruction and has focused from its inception on adult and military students. As president, I'm sometimes asked to comment on the future of higher education and the role that technology will play. The pandemic broadened these conversations as the country went into lockdown and more traditional institutions turned to online learning platforms. For many, this transition was jarring. So I was surprised at a presentation I made not long ago by the number of higher education leaders who said that colleges and universities have already made a fundamental shift in their thinking and now recognize and embrace the role that technology must play going forward. Perhaps, but from what I have observed, many in higher education are just marking time, waiting for things to go back to the way they were before. For the stakeholders in that camp, progress at most means adopting new technologies or integrating those into previous practices rather than fundamentally taking a step forward and evolving their institutions. It is an expanded version of the assumption that taking class lectures and putting them in a PowerPoint online was all it took to create modern online education. This worldview looks at technology as a solution rather than seeing it as a vehicle, and that assumption comes with significant risk. Not only is technology expensive, it is only helpful if you have the culture and the organization to implement it and follow through on the multiple aspects of adoption, integration, support, and maintenance. Those who choose to ignore these realities are at risk of being seduced by, quote, bright, shiny objects, unquote. They look at the most vexing challenges facing higher education, challenges related to access, quality, affordability, and equity, and they say, if only we can find the right technology tool, we'll be able to fix this. If only that were true. I've now been privileged to be part of 3 of the most innovative and fastest growing institutions in America, and I haven't seen it. Please understand, these organizations are doing great things, but there is no magic bullet. We keep looking, but there is no solution that we can simply set and forget. In higher education, realities are shifting, along with demographics and expectations. And I do not believe that we have begun to come to terms with the changes that are rippling through our industry and our nation as a whole. On Morning Joe, a few days ago, someone pointed out that Americans love to move past tragedy to exuberance. After the Civil War, the Gilded Age. After World War I, the Roaring Twenties. In higher education, I believe that institutions must acknowledge that change is not going to be as simple as implementing one magical solution. Shifts of this nature and magnitude require intentionality, and intentionality requires hard work, and perhaps some soul searching. And I rarely see that level of deliberateness deeply ingrained in the culture of higher education institutions. At some point, every leader I know gets asked the question, what keeps you up at night? For me, that question always brings to mind the story of the emperor's new clothes. It's a story about how a country and its leader buy into a narrative that isn't really true. Only at the worst possible moment in a very public setting is it revealed that there is no there. The emperor isn't really wearing anything at all. When I see leaders who chase headlines rather than measurable results, my caution to them, and always to myself, is that at some point, when people take a closer look, make sure you can do the things that you say you can do. In other words, make sure you're wearing clothes. Let us not chase elusive targets that others say have solved the problem. Do the hard work of deliberation and reflection, shifting the culture, building the relationships, and holding ourselves accountable for data-informed results. When we do select new platforms or technologies, let's have a clear sense of the ROI and timeframes in which we will measure success or failure. If things do not work as we expected, let's be willing to learn what we can and move forward rather than doubling down or placing blame. For my team, that means always being focused on one central question. Did our students get from us what they came for? By adopting a truly student-centric worldview, I believe we can establish a framework in which decision-making around technology and other institutional priorities is greatly simplified. Now, I realize that the term student-centric is used with increasing frequency, and perhaps without a great deal of consideration for what it entails. What I am suggesting involves asking core questions that can only be answered by looking in the mirror. Are we truly focused on and listening to this student? And the question, is this student's success and well-being what we value above all else? I understand that those are weighty questions, but it's not enough to claim to be student-centric or innovative just because you're chasing headlines. If you hope to be student-centric, it requires reflective, deliberative work. It means asking yourself hard questions and evaluating practices that you have in place and the experiences you create, regardless of which tools you use. Time and again, I see organizations buy solutions that they never fully implement, or implement solutions and quickly become disillusioned because they do not solve the intended problems. Meanwhile, costs in terms of students' time and opportunities, as well as institutional resources, continue to mount. Just last week, I moderated a discussion about America's education deserts and the estimated 41 million Americans who live where they have no college or university within 25 miles, or where a single community college is the only broad access public institution within 25 miles. Technology offers the only practical solution, but what of the 3 million among those 41 million who lack reliable access to high-speed internet? How do we address equity gaps? And as classrooms become increasingly technology-rich, how do we keep the requirements of bandwidth, processing power, and support from becoming their own obstacles to that success? Again, I believe we must maintain focus on our students, and again, ask with honesty and humility whether the solutions we offer are the solutions they need and seek. Equally important, we must constantly remind ourselves of the possibility that in deploying technology, we may actually increase the very equity gaps that we are trying to close. I love student stories because they shine a light on the individuals that make up the categories we use so often, like student body or head count. Two stories that I've shared recently serve to highlight the points I am making here. The first is about a young man, Paul, a cybersecurity professional serving in the Air Force who faced a crisis just 18 months ago. He's a single parent of 2 young children, and as the pandemic struck, they needed him at home, and he needed to complete his master's degree in cybersecurity and find a new job. He was able to do that, and we were proud to help. And his story is far from unique. A few weeks ago, I was privileged to introduce a recent alumna, Lauren, to our University System of Maryland leadership. Before Lauren met her husband, he suffered a traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan, and his condition deteriorated even as their relationship blossomed. Lauren became his full-time caregiver and put her own career on hold. She came to view her UMGC classes as her me time. A scholarship helped reduce her financial burden, and Lauren graduated this past December, landed a new job with a veteran-owned coffee company, and gives back to the military community by serving as a program coordinator with the Yellow Ribbon Fund. These are just 2 of our students, and there are thousands more like them, with stories just as compelling and just as unique. To serve them, we must listen and have the courage and humility to challenge our own assumptions. Our success will depend not so much on the tools we choose as it will on whether we use those tools to build relationships with our students, with our faculty, and with our culture. The technology that educators and administrators now have at their disposal is truly remarkable. It can be helpful, absolutely, and even transformative, and it offers us levels of insight and control unheard of just a decade or 2 ago. In implementing it, However, we have to do the necessary work. We have to ask, how do I expect this data or this insight to help me bring a better learning experience to our students? An individual who serves with me on the board of an analytics company said something that I'll never forget. He said, there is no technology in human history that was not ultimately weaponized, which is to say, technology isn't inherently good. Our tendency, I think, is to look at technology as a panacea, when in reality, technology can be crippling. If you dive into it with the wrong expectations or fail to implement it properly, it can sap institutional energy, swallow up resources, and even destroy an organization just as easily as it can solve a problem. Go to an ed tech conference and you will meet 1,000 vendors. They are all selling solutions, but not one is selling a panacea, even if they claim to be. As education leaders, it is critical that we understand technology's limitations. If we don't have the cultural foundation in place to adopt and assimilate a solution and put it to deliberate intentional use in delivering the right learning experience to our students, we are destined to fail. In short, if we're starting with the question, what technology can solve our problems, I believe we are starting with the wrong question. I will leave you with one more student story, that of a young man growing up in a 2-bedroom home in Albany, Georgia, with his father, mother, and 7 brothers and sisters. He and his siblings went on to earn college degrees and to lives and opportunities they would never have enjoyed without the transformative influence of education. That young man was me, and I am grateful and humbled every day to have the opportunity to extend the gift of education to students in Maryland, across the country, and around the world. It could not happen without technology, but neither does it happen because of technology alone. It happens because people like you do the hard work of listening to students, seeking to understand, and leveraging technology to meet them where they are, with learning experiences that provide them with knowledge, skills, abilities, and dispositions they need to succeed in the 21st century workplace. So thank you for doing that work with me and for believing always in the power of education to transform lives. And now I'll be pleased to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. We'll give our audience a chance to submit their questions. We don't have any just yet.
Well, that's nice. I guess I answered everything.
Kara, are any questions coming in for Dr. Fowler?
Nothing yet. I just would like to give it another few seconds. There is a slight delay with the audience view, so give them another minute to submit.
And if no questions come in, Dr. Fowler provided his contact information at the end of his presentation, so you can reach out to him directly. And this session has been recorded and you'll be able to access it about 60 minutes after we conclude this session at any time over the next 90 days.
Okay, now the questions are starting to come in. First one, how do you get the academic and technology leaders to work together?
Great question. I'll give you an example from my own experience. At one of my previous jobs, I was the chief academic officer for the organization. And one of the things we were spending a lot of time working on was the various roles that you would have normally seen happen with normal faculty. This would have been certainly the role of creating assessments, creating learning environments, but also the designing of the learning experience overall. I think one of the big questions is making sure that various people appreciate the roles that you can have in that type of experience. So you certainly need the subject matter expertise and the content expertise of the faculty members. But also you want to be able to leverage within that these design skills of the various team members who understand learning experiences, and also the experience of the technology platform experts who can tell you how to bring those things together. The example I use a lot for my team members is, think of it like building a house. You certainly have all the various pieces of it. They will ultimately create the firm structure that you want, in this case, the student environment. But that will include the plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters, all of those various pieces. In the same way, I want to make sure that the instructional designers are talking to the technology platform experts and the academics. You've got to get them comfortable with what their superpower is and what they bring to the table, but also what the superpowers are of the other members of that team. So saying to them that they can do those things is only the beginning of it. Getting them to appreciate that if you try to do these things in a certain order, it's going to require all of those skill sets. So the example that I use a lot is when my instructional designers and my outcome specialists would we're in separate rooms, they would often come up with very different things. So let's say, and I'm going to use a broad example here. If John F. Kennedy had said in 1961 that we want to get a man to the moon in 1962, it would have been a very difficult thing. It's an outcome, but it's not an outcome that's realistic. And so if you have a team of people over here developing outcomes that don't understand the engineering that has to happen in that space, then what you have is a misalignment that can't be corrected easily. So getting them to see what each brings to the table helped a lot when we started dealing with, I want to create this assessment, or here's the student outcome that we want for this. So if you said, I want this student to develop this skill set, but the design team said, but that's very difficult to do for this population in 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 15 weeks, then you have to get them to understand the voice and the worldview that each brings to the table and then move forward from there. So that's part of what I try to do, is help them understand the role that each needs to play in bringing that student experience together, and then bringing them together to have that conversation and deliver on what they need to do.
Thank you. Next question. What are the best ways to reflect learning and competency in a student record?
Oh, that's going to be a couple of different things. So you're talking to several different audiences when you're talking about the student record. You're certainly talking about an institution. So are we thinking about a student going from an undergraduate degree to possibly a graduate degree school or somewhere else? Are we talking about an employer, so that the student can do those knowledge, skills, abilities, and dispositions, can actually frame those in a way that an employer is going to be dealing with? Are you talking about the general public, which has a very different set of expectations around what those skills need to be? We've started experimenting with things in the comprehensive learner record technology. We've just recently done one with a couple of different companies to try to figure out what that might look like. But the record's going to have to reflect who you're trying to deal with and should have some adaptability based upon what that is. So it is quite true if you're dealing with, for example, a competency-based education model, that it may have courses in one version, but the transcripting that I've seen that's successful also has, what does that translate to for the various audiences that you're talking to, so that the student can say to a graduate school, and here were the learning outcomes that I was dealing with, or to an employer, here are the skills that I got from either that learning experience, whether it was a course or a full program, as they move forward. So I think it has to be, as we move forward, some type of agile, adaptable piece that's able to translate these things into various forms based upon those given audiences.
Okay, great. Dr. Fowler, we allow our audience to upvote the questions that are asked. So I'm going to ask them to you in the order of the number of votes they get. And that's a reminder to our audience that if you'd like to hear a specific question answered, because there are several in the queue here, to go ahead and vote on those. So the next question is, how can you help senior leaders understand that EdTech is a strategic investment for an institution?
Well, I think one of the things goes back to that, what I was saying a little earlier, which is, how do they have an understanding of what goal they're trying to accomplish with the technology and the limitations and opportunities tied to that? A lot of institutions do spend a lot of time doing that sort of chase the bright, shiny object phrase of, oh, I heard that this platform particularly works this way, or this tool will help there. That deliberative, reflective work is very hard for leaders to do. So whenever I engage in that conversation, I start with, if this technology succeeds, what do you hope to accomplish by that? The example is, if the dog actually catches the car, what happens? And so in this example, what I would say to them is, so you put this platform out there, in what way has it actually helped the ROI that you have? Is it that you want to see more students succeed? Is it that you want to have more students complete a given experience? Is it that you wanted to help some particular population succeed that had not before? And have you thought through how this game of chess is going to play out as you continue to move it forward? And many times what I find is that that answer to the question of what does a win look like is not something that's truly been thought out. And so getting them to do that is a skill set that I encourage a lot of leaders to begin doing, looking in that mirror and being very deliberate about how they move things forward.
Okay, next question. Regarding the questions for honest reflection, if the organization's culture isn't ready, what can you do to change that?
I think that you've got to start with the culture of the organization, even before the tool. And that may be the hardest work of all, particularly if the cultural trajectory is in a different direction than it needs to be for what you're trying to do. That's one of those things that requires you to spend a lot of time with the, as my mom would say, using your 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason. So how do we go about doing the listening and bringing along the teams in a way that allows them to do? There's a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of the Team. I think it's by Patrick Lencioni, and trying to get an understanding of starting with trust, and establishing a space where you can have those conversations with them. Again, saying, if we implement this, what are our real goals? And does the institution have a transparent, clear, collaborative culture that's going to allow for that? And if not, how do you begin building that by listening to what they see as the challenges, and what they see as the challenges to the current culture in getting those things done? That sounds a little bit simplistic, but I can't emphasize enough that the start of this conversation always has to be with that sort of exercise of getting people to answer those questions of what are the wins we have and what are the wins that we want to achieve as we move forward, and how do we make sure that the team buys into that as we continue to move forward as well.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. Next question. How would one quickly see the difference between a shiny object, which may sap resources with little ROI, and a truly value-added technology or tool?
So I would say, again, that goes back to what does the win look like? And for a lot of institutions, what I have seen happen is they chase one platform over the other. And the example I'll give is when people are looking at their LMS. Do I go with Blackboard or Canvas or D2L or Moodle? And you see in the paper all the time that this school actually chose this and this school actually chose that. And what then people start saying, they start calling and saying, well, why did you choose that? And in many cases I've heard, well, 5 other institutions picked this. And I say, well, have you thought through really what you want to do with that? And what that looks like, and what are the shortcomings for whatever tool you may be currently having? The culture of a lot of places does continue to be, I'm going to go after what feels like is going to chase the next headline. And I want to encourage all of the leadership to take a step back from that and have a full reflective conversation, again, about which things actually matter for what you are trying to do. Institutions have many different missions. Some institutions are very much caught up in the research and the new knowledge that they need to contribute to society, which is excellent and an absolutely important thing to do. Some are very much focused on helping students succeed who have not historically been successful. Some are very much tied to helping a given population. I went to an HBCU for a reason, for example. So how do we make sure that in all of those instances, the institution has a clear sense of what the win is for it, and making sure that whatever tools they're adopting are going to move those strategic goals forward. I was in a conversation earlier this week with someone, and they said it's not a strategic goal. It's not achievable until I can see it in writing or in some visual optic that says, here's what we're committing ourselves to. Getting the institution to hone in on that, and then take a look at, again, what's going to happen if we actually achieve that goal, or if we achieve, the implementation of this tool, is a big part of the conversation.
How important are corporate partnerships in providing access and equity? Or is there a competitive aspect with employers?
I would say that, first of all, particularly when we're talking about a lot of the students that we serve here at UMGC and for a number across the country, corporate partnerships are critically important to that work. All the more so because, remember, for the vast majority of our students who are here, they are here specifically because they are trying to upskill themselves, get a new job, improve improve the lives of their family through getting a raise, any number of those types of things. And going back to that question earlier about the comprehensive learner record, being able to say we are clearly aligning ourselves through outcomes and experiences, and in many cases, stackable experiences, with the things that our corporate partners are looking for, enables those students to think through what they are getting for the money that they're going to be spending on the education. So in a lot of the instances, when we begin to build out those experiences, we like to bring in practitioners from the field and academics from the classroom. Sometimes we have people who've actually exercised in both, what a former colleague of mine called pracademics, because they're practitioners and academics working together to figure out how do we align those types of things so that we are aligned across the board. I don't see that the corporate world as a competitor in the work that we are trying to do, but I do see in a number of instances, more and more in the last several years, a lot of corporate teams building out their own learning experiences because the experiences that we have don't necessarily serve the populations they are trying to serve, whether that's an internal population or a group of people who are somehow associated with that. So I think we've got to find ways to ask ourselves internally more how we can work with them, because one way or the other, what we are seeing more and more is that corporate partners are looking to solve these issues either with higher education institutions or on their own.
Okay, next question. I love the principle of an organization questioning its own assumptions. In evolving to student-centered education, do you think there are specific assumptions that must be addressed at most universities?
Yes. And I think that this was the question I got asked. I was at ASU GSV earlier this year. And it was very much around, do we believe that the institutions have done the hard work of making that pivot towards what they need to be moving forward? I haven't seen that yet at a lot of institutions. I see a lot of institutions, as I said, who want to go back to the way things were, as opposed to really thinking through what's going to come next. So when we're talking about the creating of these experiences that are student-centered, it's one thing to say we put our students first. But when you take a look at the actions, the priorities, the various things that are going on, if you, sometimes they talk about if you want to see what someone values, follow the money trail. In this instance, I would say follow the actions of the institution. Are those actions truly focused on coming to the point where they're saying, is this the right thing to help students succeed or not? Then it often falls back on, well, this has always been the tradition. It's too hard to make these changes. But you've got to work your way through that, especially as we're dealing with more and more of these sort of various roles that you're seeing in technology as we move forward. Every year I see these sort of landscape documents that talk about all of the various companies in ed tech that are out there now helping with everything from student success to career services to learning environments. All of these various groups can help, but they can also be bright, shiny objects that are keeping people from really focusing on what they need to, which is which things are going to help most of our students succeed as they move forward. So I challenge and I actually offer a lot with my colleagues the efforts that we need to do to get to that spot.
How do you communicate to faculty all the considerations that should be weighed, both by them and the institution, before adopting technology for coursework?
Well, a couple of things. One, and I always go back to this, is this something that is going to help more students succeed or actually make it harder for students to succeed? So if you've got to spend a huge amount of your time explaining the technology to the student, then you may have already lost them. So how do you start with, the first goal is to come out of this with more students being successful. I think the next part of this is, can this be a tool that is scalable and sustainable? So if you're trying to serve more students and help them to be successful, creating something that fewer students are going to have access to or fewer students are going to be able to work their way through does not help. Is it a tool that the faculty can readily adapt or readily adopt? Because if they can't, if they're going to spend all their time doing it, then again, you're taking away from their ability to help more students be successful. So when it comes to sometimes the tools that feel like when you first see them, they're the most useful, the complexity of implementation, the resistance to adaptation, All of these are things that I would ask the faculty members to take into consideration. Sometimes the answer is a new tool, but more than often it's about process and about the substance of what you're trying to really accomplish. Getting people to really reflect on that and really think that through is not always easy, especially when everybody's telling you you need to go after this new tool. Of course, for many years, we've heard now about this concept of things like MOOCs and other things. And I remember when MOOCs first really hit the stage, there was a push, even from many boards across the country, for universities to go down that path of if we aren't doing MOOCs, then we aren't being successful. And maybe MOOCs are going to help a substantial portion of the population get what they're looking for. But again, it can't simply be we're doing this because other people are telling us this is what it needs to be. Clear-eyed focus on what your strategy has to be the solution, and an understanding of what it really takes. So one of the things that we see a lot now is that we're implementing a lot of project management technologies in place, or in technology tools in place to help us really think through first this, then this. We're planning to get here by this time. And if we do, what are the milestones that are going to tell us we're being successful? And how do we define ultimately the win from this? So if we're expecting to see that this is going to help us with retention, when are we expecting to see that? What are the obstacles that we can anticipate? How do we work through those various pieces? Are critical questions that I believe we've got to deal with when it comes to new technologies.
Dr. Fowler, does UMGC extend their offerings to K-12 students through dual enrollment through any collaboratives?
We do actually have a couple of programs. We have a D3 program here with Prince George's County, some of the schools within the area. And we are also looking at a number of other dual enrollment programs, not just with colleges, but as you point out, with schools at the high school. I couldn't hear what you said. Now, can you repeat that last part just a little bit?
We're still in the question about K-12 offerings to K-12 students.
Okay, so yes, that was what I was saying was about, we work with some of the high schools here in Prince George's County on making sure that we have dual enrollment or collaborative programs with them. We offer every couple of years or every year a certain amount of those scholarships actually to students who may start in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And if they move forward, they can actually advance and get their degrees at an accelerated pace as well. So we do a number of those types of programs throughout the area, looking to expand those throughout the country and some other places as we're looking at not just our community college partnerships, but high schools and other places, especially high schools that have had some type of virtual experience as they move forward.
Okay, next question. Where are some of the most prominent education deserts that you mentioned?
So those are especially prominent in a number of areas throughout the Midwest. You see them even somewhere, and certainly if you're looking at time zones around the country, you'd be looking at, say, a lot of the mountain time zones, but you're also seeing the education deserts that we're talking about even within cities. So I'll give you a couple of examples of those. You saw during the pandemic a lot of students trying to find a place to have Wi-Fi, to the extent where you saw in many cases students trying to park themselves outside of buildings like libraries or museums so that they could basically download their homework to get those. We heard in a number of places, I believe I even saw out in California in a couple of places, mobile Wi-Fi labs, trying to move around to various communities that didn't have Wi-Fi or bandwidth so that students could literally come there and get their work. So you've certainly got these broad geographical places that are education deserts where you don't have a school within a certain amount of distance, which means that you pretty much limited their ability to gain the new skills and abilities through a traditional college education that you have. But then you've also got these sort of technology deserts as well. And some of those don't simply exist within these sort of broad swaths of the country. Some of those exist even within cities. So on one hand, I'm interested absolutely in the geographic piece. But on the bigger side of things, what I'm really focused on is even if we are creating new technological experiences, in some of these cities, we may in fact be creating new deserts because the experiences require so much bandwidth or so much technology that you couldn't download it from your home in a reasonable time, or you don't have the technology tools to do that. Some schools, as you saw, began to give out computers and other things during the pandemic. After this pandemic begins to hopefully subside in the next period of time, what are we going to be learning from that process about the experiences we put our students through? And how do we make sure that the people who need it most have more of that? So yes, geographically, middle of the country, a lot of sort of large states that you think about, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Missouri, some of those types of places. But even more so, if you're looking at a technology map as opposed to a geographic map, I suspect that those education deserts are going to be even more critical for us to figure out solutions to, and perhaps even more challenging in some ways.
Okay, and it looks like there's just one last question. Do governments and charities have a role to play, or is it up to universities and colleges to ensure there is no digital divide?
Okay, I think that the question was around, is it up to universities and colleges to do most of this work on their own as opposed to governments and other organizations? We are partnering with all types of organizations and governmental agencies as well to make sure these things are going to be happening. So I think that absolutely that's going to be the case. And in fact, in a lot of these instances, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, even sometimes at the local level, being able to say, what are the resources we can deploy? So some of these may be things like technology, but some of them may be simply new ways of thinking about things. One of the things at a previous institution when I was working there, we were looking at was working with inner cities to use libraries in a different way when it came to helping the local community gain their skill sets. That required us to be able to work with those libraries to say, how do we set you up for that type of success? How do we make sure that the various populations in the community have access to it? Those types of things are critical questions. And of course, as we're dealing with different types of organizations, many of them are contributing as well, whether it is, again, through technology tools or through an understanding of how we can work with various populations. We have recently partnered with Excelencia in Education to figure out more about how we can help our Latina students be more successful here in the local community. And we intend to use those types of knowledge, experiences, and other things to help more of our students be successful as well. So this is not simply a higher education institution thing. This has to be a community thing because the whole community is going to be impacted regardless of whether or not we succeed. So we hope that we can.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler, for that inspirational talk. I'm sure if we were in person, you would be hearing a rousing round of applause for your session. So thank you again. And I hope everyone enjoyed the session today. And please look at all the other opportunities to interact with our sponsors in their booths this evening from 5 to 6 and their sessions today, tomorrow, and Thursday morning. Hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.